A quick word about the undercard for this show before I speak on David Adeleye's most recent performance. The only two fights I found remotely entertaining on this card were the main event, Joe Joyce versus Takam, and David Adeleye against Mladen Manev. Now, it's not that either of those fights were particularly great. It's more the fact that the rest of the card was very boring. And that includes Hamza Shiraz. No disrespect to Hamza Shiraz, but I'd heard a lot about the guy. Some people comparing him to Tommy Hearns. I mean, the Tommy Hearns comparison really is, I'm going to say, insulting. Because the only similarity between Hamza Shiraz and Tommy Hearns is that they're both tall, skinny fighters. But the similarities stop there. Hamza Shiraz is very slow compared to Tommy Hearns. Very slow. Doesn't have that kind of punching power. Also doesn't fight long. He stands up tall, squares his shoulders, throws a lot of short punches. Stylistically, he's more similar to Antonio Margarito than Tommy Hearns. Not that he's as defensively reckless and irresponsible as Margarito. Perhaps he's technically better than Margarito, but the basic principle of what he applies in the ring, walking guys down behind a high guard with squared up shoulders, that's what Margarito used to do, throwing uppercuts and short punches, giving up his height. So again, no disrespect to Hamza Shiraz at all. I'm just speaking from the perspective of a boxing fan who wants to be entertained. And I did not find Hamza Shiraz entertaining in that performance. And in general, I just don't find his style or his ability entertaining at all. And the same goes, and it's not like I'm trying to pick on Hamza Shiraz here, because if anything, the rest of the undercard was even more dull. There was one guy on there, I can't remember his name now, but he was somewhat okay. But everybody else on there, all the other fights, extremely dull. And I was falling asleep by the time the main event rolled around, and it did wake me up a bit because it was more eventful. Now, I'll talk about the glove situation in the Joe Joyce post-fight. In fact, let me touch on it briefly now. So I made a video addressing the controversy about fly gloves, where the WBC has banned or suspended the use of fly gloves for the foreseeable future, pending an investigation. Now, in the UK, because Fly are a British brand and they are quite prestigious now, in the UK, lots of fighters train and fight in fly gloves. This Frank Warren show didn't have a single fighter, from what I saw, that had fly gloves on. Not one. That's unusual. A second thing that's unusual is that seemingly as a substitute for fly gloves, there were lots of fighters wearing Salvador gloves. Now, Salvador, I think they're Mexican, but they're certainly a South American brand, Salvador. I've heard a lot of good things about them from various YouTube boxing equipment reviewers and what have you. I've never seen them used in the UK before now. As I say, they appear to be a substitute for Fly. Were they a substitute suggested by the WBC themselves? How come the entire show didn't have fly gloves on? Because as far as I'm aware, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, the British Boxing Board of Control haven't banned fly gloves. Has Frank Warren banned fly gloves on his shows? I don't know. I'm just interested to find out why there was no fly gloves on this show. Shout out to G-Man, because he said that the Joe Joyce Takam fight had some type of WBC trinket on the line, the international title or something. I think, didn't Joyce win that against Dubois? Or maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree. But that's just one fight. That's not the whole show. It's not like the whole show was WBC sanctioned. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. So why wouldn't you see fly gloves on the undercard? It would make sense if there was specific WBC sanctioned bouts on the card that people didn't have fly gloves on. But no, this was the whole show. And Joe Joyce, as we know, always wears fly gloves. Or for the majority of his career, for most of his fights, from what I can remember, he's worn fly gloves. So, yeah, if anybody's got more information about that, please leave it in the comments below, because I'm very interested to find out why there was no fighters wearing fly on this show. As you can see, Adeleye is wearing Rival, and his opponent, Manev, well, I can't tell from this angle, and I'm not going to press play here and catch any kind of copyright strike. So let's get on to this fight. There were, I think, 3 heavyweight fights on this card. Adeleye versus Manev, the main event with Joyce and Takam, and also George Fox, who is Don Charles' son, I believe, fought in the undercard, although I didn't see that fight. Now with this fight right here, Adeleye versus Manev, a lot of people were not impressed by this performance, as they weren't impressed by his previous performance against Kamil Sokolovsky, but at least he won this fight decisively. It didn't go to the cards, the judges. There was no ambiguity about who won. There was no controversy. It was a clear-cut win by stoppage for Adeleye. But a lot of people were very critical of the lack of a jab from Adeleye. He was just pawing with it throughout. Now, I've spoken before about the jab and how you don't need to always be sticking out a ramrod jab every time, particularly at heavyweight. Different people have, different endurance for different things. So some guys could throw a left hook all day and their left arm will never get tired. Other guys throw a few left hooks and their arms are tired. People's bodies are different. The same goes with a jab. Some guys will be like Larry Holmes and they'll stick a piston-like jab on you for 12 rounds. And they still got a piston jab in the 12th, right? But other guys, especially the bigger, heavier guys, I remember Lennox Lewis. When he was in a tough fight, his jab got slower and more cumbersome, and I'm struggling to find the words here, but the quality of his jab deteriorated throughout the course of many of his bouts, particularly if he was in a tough bout. But 11th, 12th, that wasn't a snapping jab anymore. He was pushing it out and kind of thudding with it. And Lennox Lewis at the time got criticized for pawing with his jab a lot. But again, a lot of people don't realize that a guy that size with such long arms, the physiology of him, it didn't make it practical for him to be able to throw every jab as a ramrod jab. So he had to mix up, and there are various reasons why you would mix up the strength of the jab. Sometimes you don't want to get your opponent used to the speed and the power of the jab, so you mix it up to confuse him. Maybe he's blocking the jab, so you have to vary it up. Give him different looks, different angles. Throw the jab from a low position, throw it from a high position. Stutter the jab. There are lots of different things you can do with a left jab. This idea that every jab just needs to be a telegraph pole. No. There might be some fights where that's appropriate, but for a lot of fights, no, you don't want to do that. I remember when Manny Stewart trained Lennox Lewis for the Oliver McCall rematch. Of course, he trained Oliver McCall for the first Lewis McCall fight, but for the rematch, he was training Lennox Lewis. And he said they watched a lot of tapes of George Foreman before that McCall rematch. And Foreman would often pull with the jab as well as throwing it solidly. And they said they wanted to emulate what Foreman was doing, because sometimes he would just pull with a jab to keep the opponent in place. Not necessarily trying to hurt them with it, but more of a setup and more of a instrument of distance control. You see? So Manny Stewart went in there basically telling Lennox Lewis to pull with a lot of his jabs. Training for him to do that. So there is a method to some of this stuff, people, okay? With all that being said, with David Adeleye, watching the whole fight through, was there even one time when he threw a solid jab? Because I'm all for guys varying up the jabs, right? But I don't recall, this is a highlights video here, this is not the full fight, but when I was watching it live, I don't recall a time when he actually threw a solid, proper jab. It was all just pawing, just little taps, range finding, trying to trigger a lead from his opponent. No stepping in with it, no real hard jabs to the body and then going up to the head. And I do find that a little strange that he didn't throw any hard jabs at all. Yeah? Could there be an issue with David Adelaye's left shoulder? Or maybe it's just a case of him never having developed the jab. I don't know. But one thing I can tell you for me is that I always had a very solid jab when I was boxing. But I dislocated my shoulder in sparring. This must have been around, I want to say 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. I dislocated my shoulder in sparring, and my shoulder has never been the same since. I've never had an operation on it, and I've known people with a similar injury that went and had an operation. But basically, my dislocated shoulder healed by itself. And it wasn't a full dislocation. It was like a partial dislocation, but it's very painful. And I felt it come out, and then it kind of, went back in. And the shoulder's never been the same since. The shoulder, if I throw too many jabs, particularly if I'm shadowboxing or if I miss a jab, it'll feel as though the shoulder's loose and it's not tight in the socket. So I don't know whether it's the tendons or the ligaments or whatever it is have stretched. And I believe that's the operation that people have, is they'll have an operation to shorten the tendon or shorten the ligament, whatever it is. I always get confused between the two, right? But to shorten the tendon so that it basically the shoulder sits more flush in the socket again, right? Because of course these things are holding it in place. So I've always had, since that time, this issue with my shoulder. Now it comes and goes, but that's one of the reasons why subsequent to that, when I did spar, I was tentative about throwing jabs. Whereas before I'd be ramming a jab out there, not really worried about anything. But after I had that dislocation, and because of that weird kind of loose feeling that my shoulder had after that, I just wasn't as confident in throwing hard jabs anymore, particularly against opponents. It was okay on the bag because you're not going to miss the bag with a jab. But when you're in the ring against an opponent, you could miss. And when you miss, that's when you can overextend. And that's when the shoulder starts feeling funny again. So again, that's pure speculation on my part in terms of whether Adelaye's got a similar problem. And, perhaps at his age, he would just, and he's a professional fighter. I was never a professional. Surely he would just go and have an operation to get that sorted out. Although after the operation, I know somebody that had this operation and they had to wait quite a long time before they were able to throw the jab and what have you. I mean, many months before they were able, and they also had to do a lot of physio on it before it ever felt the same again. So anyway, pure speculation. I just do find it interesting that I can't remember even one time when he threw a proper jab. It was all just point with it. So perhaps that's something that we might see him address moving forward. I don't know. Now, as far as the rest of the performance goes, it was apparent to me that he didn't want to get hit the way he got hit in his last fight against Sokolovsky. Not because he's afraid of getting hit by this journeyman here. And by the way, I do have to give this guy, Mladen Manev, some credit because he showed up to give it a go. The shape he was in didn't give you much confidence before the fight that he was going to give it a go. But when he got in there from the opening bell, he was swinging and he was really trying. Perhaps he was inspired by what he saw Sokolovsky do in Adeleye's previous fight. And he thought, you know what? I got a chance here. Let me give this a go. Apparently, Manev had an extensive amateur background, so there was a level of competence there, despite the fact that he was out of shape. So he came to give it a go, and Adeleye didn't want to give him any opportunity to get through with anything clean, because Sokolovsky got through with clean punches. Nothing really hurt Adeleye, but he did get through with clean punches, and I think Adeleye felt disappointed in himself, disappointed in his own defense, and he wanted to improve that. So he went into this fight seemingly with the objective of not getting hit first and foremost, and then building everything on top of that. So don't get hit, and then just concentrate on making the opponent miss and making him pay. And this is something I often tell people who are asking for advice with regards to their first amateur fight or sparring or anything like that, first time sparring. I always say to them, concentrate on not getting hit and stick to the basics. So if you're nervous, if you're not sure how you're going to do in the spar, just concentrate on avoiding what your opponent is doing. And if you feel nervous, just stick to the jab. Just hit him with jabs in the face, because you're likely going to be matched against somebody of a similar experience level to yourself. So if it's your first fight, it might be his first fight or his second or third. It's not going to be somebody who's extremely advanced. So keeping your defense tight and sticking to the basics, something as simple as a jab, will often be very effective in a scenario like that. Let him be the one who comes out swinging and doing all kind of wild stuff. And you just tuck up nice and tight, boom, boom, hit him with a jab down the middle. Nice and simple. So I'm all for fighters keeping it basic when they're learning on the way up. Obviously, if a fighter can do more than that and can do so without getting tagged all over the place, even better. But if a fighter's looking to develop, and this fight right here for Adeleye, it's a learning fight. So understand what this is. This is not a showcase. This is a learning fight. Just as the Sokolovsky fight was a learning fight. And therefore, you're going to try things out. You're going to go in there with a certain mindset, a certain intention of improving on what you did last time out. Last time out, I'm sure he feels he got hit too much. So this time out, he said, you know what? I'm not going to get hit. Whether that means the fight turns out to be boring, so be it. I'm not going to get hit. And lo and behold, he really didn't get hit in this fight. Now, he wasn't particularly impressive offensively for most of it. I've already addressed his jab. He was looking to walk Manev onto shots and what have you. And nothing was particularly accurate. His corner were telling him to let go of more shots. Telling him that he's trying to be too precise and too accurate. You need to let more shots go. I think that's what I remember them telling him. You need to let your hands go a bit more. But again, he was cognizant of, not getting hit, avoiding taking the kind of shots he took against Sokolovsky. Anyway, his opportunity came in I believe it was the 4th round, and he managed to get Manev out of there, and he did land some good shots, good uppercut, I seem to remember. And the fight was eventually stopped. Manev was down twice, I believe. In fact, let me just check the record here. Yeah, Manev was down twice prior to the stoppage, and that was in the 4th round. It was only a 6th rounder. So, yeah, he got the guy out of there. He didn't look $1 million by any stretch of the imagination. He looked novice-y, not necessarily in terms of his technique, because he's a well-balanced fighter. He throws his punches pretty well. But novice-y in terms of he didn't have the aura of a fighter who is anywhere near the finished article. Do you know what I mean? He doesn't have the poise and the authority of a fighter who's close to being the finished article or is the finished article. It's that, Adeleye comes across as a very confident person if you hear him in interviews and whatever. And, he fights somewhat confidently in the ring, but you can still tell that he's very inexperienced. Yeah, that shows through in his performances. So he's a work in progress. He's only 24 years of age, 6'4.5" from Ladbroke Grove in West London. Currently 7-0 with 6 KOs. Interestingly, for a guy who's relatively tall, 6'4.5", he's not that heavy. He turned pro at 217. And if you look at his physique, he looks quite muscular. But I guess his legs are not that big, or whatever the case may be. Maybe his bones or his muscles are not that dense. I don't know. But for 6'4.5", a guy who looks muscular like that doesn't weigh much. Just to put it in perspective, he's about the same height as Daniel Dubois. Dubois weighs at least, 10, 15 pounds more than this guy? And they're about the same height. Kubrat Pulev is about the same height, and Kubrat Pulev weighs between 240 and 250. So you're talking about 15 to 25 pounds heavier Kubrat Pulev is than this guy, even though they're about the same height. So he's not particularly heavy for his height. He's quite light, but that might actually work to his advantage because he is fast. He's got quick hands. He's light on his feet. This is not a plodder at all. You don't look at David Adeleye as a plodder in terms of the way you might look at Daniel Dubois, who does plod around the ring a lot of the time. I mean, even Dylan White, who's listed at 6'4", a lot of people say he's shorter than that. He tends to plod far more than somebody like David Adeleye, right? I'm not saying that these guys are worse than Adeleye, of course, but I'm just pointing out some of the particular strengths Adeleye has. Certain athletic ability. Because he's light, he is able to move around the ring quite well. And this is another reason I keep banging on about this, why I don't think heavyweights need to be a particular weight for their height. There was this obsession for a while with Deontay Wilder, for example. Oh, he's too skinny. He needs to be 235 or 240 pounds. He can't be coming in at 215. It's too small. I totally disagree. Whatever weight works for you is what works for you. Whatever weight is your natural weight, and you can punch hard at that weight, and you can move around well at that weight, then that's the weight you should be at. Don't worry about what people think you should weigh. And with Adeleye, there's no indication. I mean, turned pro in 2019 at 217. He's about 10 pounds heavier now. Is that going to continue? Obviously, he's a very young man, so he's going to fill out naturally. But I would like to see him stay on the lighter side to retain that kind of mobility he has, so he doesn't become as plodding as the other heavyweights out there, because I think that could be a real asset for him going forward. It could be perhaps even a saving grace for him going forward, especially if he doesn't develop that jab the way that we would like to see him develop it. So, yeah, that's my take on David Adeleye versus Mladen Manev. It was a learning fight. He was testing out certain things. He clearly didn't want to get hit the way he did against Sokolovsky. He didn't want to leave anything to chance. He certainly didn't want to have another fight where he's getting hit with enough shots to allow the perception among the public to form that he didn't win the fight. Yeah, he doesn't want to repeat of that. He didn't want to repeat of that. And so he was very circumspect about the way he went about this job. So it is what it is. I see him as very wet behind the ears, very green. Just a prospect at this stage. Apparently, I don't know if this is actually confirmed or true, but I think they said this on the BT broadcast. He didn't have much of an amateur career, which is, a little surprising to me because he doesn't look that raw in terms of his technique. Sometimes guys who, or quite often guys who don't have much of an amateur career, their technique can look quite raw, but his technique looks fairly polished. Looks like somebody who did have, a decent number of amateur bouts, but if that's true, it's quite impressive. It's like Anthony Yarde, right? Anthony Yarde had very few amateur bouts, but his technique is very polished for somebody so inexperienced. Very polished. Then you've got the opposite end of the scale, Joe Joyce, who had a load of amateur bouts and WSB bouts, but his technique looks very crude and novice-y. So some people pick up technique and polish a lot more quickly than others. It is what it is. A lot of it has just got to do with body mechanics, biomechanics, however you want to describe it. So give me your thoughts in the comments below about David Adeleye. I'm sure most of them are going to be negative. I mean, if you have the ability to be objective, it's not about being an Adeleye fan or anything like that. Not at all. It's just about looking at the potential there and saying, can something be done with this? Rather than condemning him, he didn't do a jab and he should have knocked it. Forget about all that. Just look at the raw potential, the size, the athleticism, the coordination, and say, okay, can something be done with this? The thing which prevents fighters who have ability, in most cases, from making the most out of their ability, taking their ability as far as it can possibly go, the thing that prevents them most of the time is what goes on inside their head. Maybe they don't have the right mindset. Maybe they don't have the innate intelligence, and I'm talking about athletic intelligence, the ring IQ. Maybe they don't have the requisite level of confidence, or maybe they have a propensity for extreme overconfidence, which leads to complacency. There are all kinds of different factors which come into play with regards to the mind of a fighter. But I'm sure many of you by now, if you've been following boxing for a number of years, will have seen examples of fighters who have natural ability, natural gifts, but they don't have it inside their heads. And therefore, they really don't go anywhere. Okay? But that remains to be seen with Adeleye. At the moment, I'm assessing the physical ability and what can be done with that. Yeah? So, give me your thoughts in the comments below. Come and join me on Patreon and access my weekly no-holds-barred, censorship-free podcast where we lift the lid on a wide range of controversial topics. It's not mainstream friendly, it's not politically correct, but that's the whole point. We dare to stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Hot Topics. You'll gain access to a minimum of 2 hours of exclusive content every single week, including podcasts, videos, interviews, live stream Q&A sessions, as well as my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Not to mention a vast back catalog of hundreds of hours of previous episodes. You can listen via the Patreon app with the option to download in high quality MP3. We've also got a Discord server where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. There's no contract, no commitment, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.